Good evening and welcome again, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. That song was Red Cadillac by famed Ottawa musician Claude Gabremont. My friend, if you like that, send us a note and let us know. A little rockier than last month's smooth jazz selection for sure. This is week 6 of the Musky Monday seminar series. Tonight's topic is Pressured and Tough Times Muskies with Dr. Sean Landsman. Catching no muskies is a big part of muskie fishing, and there's a lot of days where we fish for one fish a day. So pressure changes everything, and dealing with tough times is just what we do more than half the time out there. So you need to have an answer. You need to understand what the fish are doing. You need to have some tactics and tricks to deal with that, and that's what today's show is all about. So we're going to talk about pressure from a whole bunch of different angles, probably some angles that you haven't considered before. We're going to talk about water body pressure. We're going to talk about community spot pressure, seasonal pressure. We're going to talk about technological pressure, which the way technology is changing in the modern day, in your boat and online, both apply a whole lot more pressure to our spots, to our system, and to our fish. We're going to talk about COVID pressure. I never even thought of that till this past week. I'll tell you where I got that from in a couple of minutes. And we'll talk about pressure and its effects on fishing. We'll talk about it in terms of its effects on fish populations. When you get older, you start to think of things on a macro level, on a much bigger level. And so, you're only as good as the population of fish that you're fishing for. And so ensuring the viability of that population in the long term, it's in all of our best interests. We're going to talk about tough times fishing tonight. That's your blue skies, your ultra high pressure, your post-frontal conditions, your ultra low pressure. We're going to talk about brownouts when your system has had so much rain that your river or lake turns to chocolate milk. We're going to talk about flooding. Those are some tough conditions that we've dealt with, both in Canada and the U.S. And so what do you do on those days? And before we get to those, we're going to go over the effects of sound or sound effects in the water and on your fish. And sound is, I think Dr. Bruce Tufts out of Queen's University, I believe he's the sound expert in Canada, and he calls this the new frontier in fishing. And us musky people are usually the last adapters of new technology. The bass community pays a whole lot more attention to sound. Probably we should in the musky world too. So we're going to look at lure sounds, motor sounds, electric motor sounds, the sound of your transducer, boat noise, different noises you make in your boat and how that affects things. And then we're going to answer the age-old question, does blasting Motley Crue on the sound system in your boat actually help you catch more fish? So we'll go there in just a few minutes time with Dr. Sean, and there's some really interesting observations on that. We've had that talk a few times. It all goes to a lot of different places. We always get our thank yous out of the way at the start of this program. I'm trying to do them faster and faster. Thank you, the viewer. This is a viewer-driven program about questing for musky knowledge. So your questions, your topics for our program, your questions for Sean, for Ask the Biologist, physiology, behavior, research. We want to cover a whole lot of areas. You drive where we go. So please, especially today, send in your questions. Originally, I had advertised today's program as having two great guests, my great friend Wally Robbins and monster young fisherman Liam Wetter, but we had technological problems yesterday and decided that we just couldn't pull that one off for you. So lucky you got Dr. Sean for the whole show. take advantage of it. Send your questions in. We're going to use a whole lot more for this evening as well. I got to say thank you to my team as always. Mike Spratt, my partner in Musky Factory Baits. He is MacGyver, and he is the Motley Crue monster in the boat. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Lisa Goodyear, full-time guide extraordinaire for the Musky Factory and the producer of our show. Lisa, appearing magically right now. How you doing?
I'm doing good, John. How about you?
Fantastic. Maestro behind the scenes. Lisa makes everything come on and off the screen, displays your questions, and she answers questions behind the scenes as well. Thank you for all you do as usual and for making us look as good as possible. I know that's a challenge. I appreciate that greatly, Lisa. And we'll see you in a little while. Thanks. And Mike Kadura. Mike is the super guide, Mike Kadura. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Hey, I'm pretty good, John. I'm pretty good. How are you?
Awesome. Always behind the scenes. He's one of the people answering your questions. We're like 200 comments and questions for every episode so far. So we get to them today. We get to them later tonight. We get to them tomorrow. It's Mike. It's Lisa. It's myself. You've got a face, a pretty face to associate with who's writing to you. And Mike, I'm really sorry about that bet on Mahomes advice I gave out a few weeks ago. You didn't take that seriously, did you?
Betting on him? Yeah. I'm okay.
You're okay?
Yeah.
You know, here's some more good advice. Take Musky advice from a guide, but don't bet on football based on what he says.
Right.
That's the new version of advice for today.
Yeah.
All right, Mike. Thanks a lot as usual.
See you around, guys.
Shortly. Shimano, celebrating 100 years. Huge part of my fishing world for a long time. Shimano drives technology in this world, in the fishing world. They support the research. You should support who supports you. Look around and find out about that. Suick Lures, Team Suick. I'm a really proud member of Team Suick, along with Brent Bocek. And Brent, you're out there most weeks. I know, Brent, you've got a new TV show that just came out this week. I don't have the link for it, but say hi to us, send it in, and Lisa's going to post it later. It's an episode of Brent's new program, Setting the Hook. It's on right now in Southern Ontario and a couple of channels, and it's going online shortly as well. We'll get that up for you. Chaos Tackle, Rick Albers, great guy. Company that keeps growing bigger and bigger for a reason. Andre Lalone, best boat guy I ever had out in Wendover, Ontario. You got a boat question about anything, talk to Andre. Crestliner Boats and Mercury Motors. And Muskies Canada. We love Muskies Canada for so many reasons. There is no better place for you to learn about Muskies than through Muskies Canada. All the freaks that you want to find, people with your addiction, people with worse than your addiction, people that have wasted their whole life on the water. Those guys are all there. So they have the answers you want to know. Did you know that if you're in the military, you can get a free Muskies Canada membership? It's true. We love the military people and all that they do for us. Just one of the many neat things that Muskies Canada does and a cause that they support. So many good reasons to join them. The badge, Muskie Research, sport fishing and Muskie Research. We love that concept so much. Muskie Factory Baits donates $2 from every lure that we sell directly to Muskie Research through Muskies Canada. And that research comes back to you as an angler, catches you more fish because of that, and it makes sure that your fishery is managed well, and it looks after your fish populations intelligently, science-based, the way that they have to be in the modern day. Conditions are changing more than ever. Research is more important than ever. Monitoring populations more important than ever. We'll cover that topic on and off today as we go. So thanks to Muskies Canada. If you're a learning fan, I tell you that there's 15 meetings a month, 15 seminars, kind of like we do. You can go there for your membership to all of those if you want. There may be a big announcement at the Spring Fishing and Boat Show. Andy Pilata, one of the monster energy guys in the fishing world, who does so much in the bass world and the sports show world. And he's got Musky Sunday coming on next weekend with Jim Sarek, who will be on our program on March 1st. Jeremy Smith, sorry, from the In Fisherman, one of the most knowledgeable guys on the planet in terms of chasing muskies these days. Go check that out at Musky Sunday next weekend, and there may be a big announcement on there, and we'll have it next week if there is. Coming up on our program next week, Larry Ramsell. If you don't know who Larry Ramsell is, you're young, and you should. He's one of the most influential people in the muskie world in the last 50 years or more. I read my first Larry Ramsell article in 1980, and it changed my life. And so he's coming here to talk about his career, but more than that, he's the muskie historian. So we're going to talk about world records, real and imagined. And, you know, muskie people, there's a lot of liars and a lot of ego, and that goes on in the fishing world and especially in the muskie world through time. And a lot of records have been thrown out. We'll talk about all the disgraced records. We'll talk about real records. What is a record? Who determines this? And we're going to look at the biggest fish of all time in Canada. We're going to look at the Ken O'Brien world record. And I'll throw this out. You know, I've been trying to find Ken O'Brien out there. Ken, I'm a huge fan of the fish you caught. I'm a huge fan of the whole story of your fish. And as a muskie guy, I feel really bad that that something that was so special at that time got taken down or discredited or disgraced, or people threw crap on it, you know, for a lot of different reasons. Ken never set out to cheat anybody or do anything bad. And, you know, it just happens in the muskie world. People post stuff. There's haters everywhere. Heaven forbid you handle a fish wrong and you're a kid holding your first fish up. The haters jump on it all the time. You know, if Ken O'Brien's out there, and I would love to talk to you and just hear your story. I think it's an incredible one. I'm a fan. It comes from that perspective. And we'll talk about everything that's going on with that fish and the Martin Williamson fish. Last real fish over 60 pounds, verified dead. And there is a whole story with that fish at 61 pounds, 4 ounces, 13 years old. It says a lot, the science behind it. So tune in next week. Getting on to our Ask the Biologist segment today, and Dr. Sean Landsman. How important is sound in your fishing? Well, a lot of muskie people think I'm fishing for a giant fish that swims faster than anything else in the water, that's not afraid of anything. So, you know, sound, not that big a deal, not going to be a distraction. Sound influences muskies and muskie fishing and muskie behavior way, way, way more than you know. There's so many things to consider. First of all, fish have an inner ear. They have all the senses that we do in a different form, but fish actually have an inner ear and they process sound. So, and sound travels way faster underwater than anywhere else, and in a much different way. So, your sound has a big effect on them. They also have a lateral line that allows them to feel vibration, but sound also sends off vibration. If you've stood in front of concert speakers at a concert, like I have done many times for a long time, you know that sound will make your whole body shake. And, you know, we'll talk about that vibration sense with it as well. that vibration and that sound, that allows muskies to hunt so well in the dark and in dirty water that they're still able to hit fish in the head. I believe it was 19 out of 20 times on the only old day study I know ever done on that. So that's huge. That's huge that they can still do that. The sound of your lure is a huge topic. Rattles, various things that we put in lures to make sounds. The sound of wood or plastic knocking together on a jointed lure, another huge factor. And if you look at the baits that are the most successful, or some of the most successful baits in the modern day, hose baits, Clarkies, BR baits, those baits, there's a sound component to those jointed baits based on the type of wood, the type of joint that those baits have, and how those products collide. And some of my other favorite baits of all time. So, the conversation on sound goes so deep, banging your lure into the bottom. Musky guys have known that's a huge turn on for fish a long time. What does your radio do? What does rock and roll do? Should you have sound on or not? So many places to go with this topic. With all that in mind, I'm going to ramble for just another moment before I bring Sean on. I have some sound stories I wanted to tell you, just to consider. The Fish Finders, great programming made in Canada, homemade programming. Alan and Bill from that show. They have a neat clip on their show from years ago. They left a camera in the water during lunch, and the cord from the camera sat and brushed against rocks. And it was unbelievable how many fish came up to investigate that sound. This was on a very lightly fished lake. And that sound in their environment, something totally different, something they had to go and look at. Gord Pizer always tells a story about a famous 54-inch fish in northern Ontario that was caught and transmitted and lived in the back of a bay. And every time they went to visit that fish for the rest of the summer, the boat went in the bay, the fish went out of the bay. The fish learned that sound was a bad thing to be associated with. Some fish don't care, some fish do. We'll talk about that. Muskies are not afraid of sound in general. They are the Marines. They go to sound, but some of the bigger, more experienced fish run away from it. And John Castleman told a story in a presentation at a Gananoque Muskies Canada chapter meeting on November 11th, 2012 maybe. And I take notes at all of these, and I never forgot what he said. I might have the year wrong, but it was about a sturgeon project going on now. And he had tagged a 76-pound sturgeon on the St. Lawrence, and they went back to visit that fish with a transmitter on it. They drove near it, it left. They drove near it, it left. They drove near it, it left. John thought about it, and they had a pump on in their boat with a water tank to oxygenate the tank for the fish that they were tagging. And John surmised that fish had learned that the sound of that pump was bad for that fish. And this time, the second time seeing it, that fish left. And John giggled when he said it. And he said that fish learned that sound was bad for it. So that term "learn" for a biologist, it's a really interesting term. And Sean's going to tell us a whole lot more about that. So many things to consider with sound. Let's bring Sean out here now. He's got a whole bunch of neat things to say on the science of sound. How you doing, Sean?
I'm good. I got my IPA here, so cheers to everyone that's got their favorite beverage going for a couple hours of talking Muskies. I'm thrilled to be here. There you go, John. Cheers.
I've got my Hamilton chapter Muskies Canada meeting mug here, and I have moose milk. I have moose milk inside of mine. There's a story behind that. The story behind that we'll tell someday. But great to see you as usual. You got so much to say about sound. Where do you want to go, Sean?
Yeah, we'll go all over the place with this, but we'll go ahead and get right into it. I mean, yeah, I would say that, like, personally as an angler, I probably don't pay enough attention to sound than I maybe should. And the reason I say that is primarily because of this fact right here, that second bullet point there, that sound travels really fast underwater. I coincidentally got an email today, actually a couple emails in the last couple of days, that I think were prompted by, I know one of them was prompted by the recent media coverage of a study that looked at, they were talking about how much noise is in the marine environment and how it's affecting everything from whales to little clownfish on coral reefs. And I think this got a lot of people thinking about, what sounds do we produce that have maybe a pretty broad effect underwater? And one of the things that the media coverage talked about, or the paper, the science paper that these media outlets were covering, one of the things they were talking about was sound underwater is a really good form of communication. So think about that for a second. If any of you have ever snorkeled underwater or dived underwater, you know that you can only see so far into the water before you can't make out any shapes, or, maybe you can make out a shape, but you can't make out details. And so vision underwater becomes a lot more limited than say sound. You can hear sounds from a lot farther away than you can actually see objects. And so from a communication standpoint, sound underwater actually stands as being a pretty good tool for communicating things. And so animals living underwater will adapt to that. And so we can get into that a little bit later. But yeah, so sound travels really fast underwater. That's one thing we have to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that sound's just pressure waves. Okay, they're just pressure waves moving through the water, and they're created by a whole host of things. In the marine environment, especially on coral reefs, those are really noisy environments. You have parrotfish that are eating corals and chomping those up. And you've got, lots of fish swimming around and bumping into the bottom. And you've got waves crashing into the top of a reef. But in a lake or a river, especially a slow moving river like the bigger sections, like the lower Ottawa, those environments are actually pretty quiet. They're pretty quiet. A lake is a pretty quiet environment. If you've ever dived underwater or snorkeled in a lake, as long as there's not like a boat around, we'll get to that in a little bit, it's actually pretty quiet. It's really nice, but it's actually pretty quiet. And so animals in those quiet environments are going to be hearing natural sounds underwater that might be produced by like wind, so wave action along the shoreline, or in faster flowing streams and smaller rivers. You've got the current moving downstream, and it's moving around boulders and things. You've got stuff moving around on the bottom, so crayfish are moving around, click 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 their claws as they move around on the bottom. Carp rooting around in the substrate. But believe it or not, actually, fish swimming is another source of sound, and that's actually really important to keep in mind. And I hadn't really thought about that until several years ago when I was flipping through it was an In Fisherman article, or an In Fisherman magazine, and Doug Stange was doing a book review on this book right here, Bluegills, Biology and Behavior. And some of the early chapters of this book actually talk about the turbulence and the vortices that are created as fish swim through the water. Not just fish, but even things like mayflies and other little aquatic insects. And I'll get to that. I'll come back to that in just a second. But that's really important in terms of how we think about how a predator might be listening underwater. It's also, relevant to talk a little bit about how fish hear. And so there's a couple of different structures. John already talked about them. The inner ear stones of a fish are one of the primary ways in which fish will hear, quote unquote. These inner ear stones are sometimes called otoliths. And so here's a panel of different otoliths from different species. There's a pike otolith. So you can, I don't actually know what a musky otolith looks like because I've never pulled a musky otolith out of a dead muskie before. I've only ever actually dissected one dead muskie. But based on how similar muskies and pike are, that's probably what their otolith looks like. Okay, and an otolith sits inside the inner cranium, inside the skull of the fish, and it actually sits in what's called endolymph. So that's this dotted area around this just theoretical otolith here, and all endolymph is fluid. That's it. But the otoliths themselves are actually connected to nerve cells via these little structures called hair cells. They're these really fine structures that connect to the bony otolith itself. And the reason they have these little fine hair cells is when there's pressure waves or sound being produced in the environment, that sound will actually make its way into the inner ear. It will travel through the liquid endolymph, and it will hit the otolith. But because the otolith is a lot denser than the surrounding water, that's surrounding endolymph, it actually transmits those pressure waves really efficiently. And those pressure waves hit those hair cells, and they send signals to the brain via the nervous system. And that's how a fish is able to go, what was that? What was that? That's how they're able to do that. That's how we do that. If I snap my finger over here, that's how I'm able to determine that there's actually sound coming from this direction. Okay. One thing that we really don't have a good handle on, though, and so John at the very beginning, he talked about Dr. Bruce Tufts down at Queen's University, calling kind of like fish hearing and sound, underwater sound, kind of like the next frontier in what what we kind of understand about prey, foraging behavior, and sort of just their general environment that these fish live in. And part of that is because we really don't have a good handle on very species-specific hearing abilities of fishes. We kind of know like broad scale things. And so I'll talk a little bit about those in just a minute. But of course, one of the other systems that fish use to pick up on sound in the underwater environment is their lateral line. And you can kind of throw air quotes around here. They're kind of using their lateral line to hear things. It's not the same as when they're using their otoliths and their ear stones, but sound is just pressure waves, and that's what the lateral line does. Is it detects pressure waves. So the schematic on the right hand side of the screen you see here, what you've got is the outer layer of skin, and then the scales. And then you've got these little pores. They're little openings that connect to channels that run along the flank of the fish, on both sides of the fish, and even up into the head too. And within those channels, you actually have these little nerve cells, these cupolas. And then you've got those same hair cells that I just mentioned about the otoliths. They're connected inside this little cone of it's basically just like gel. It's like gelatin. And so when a pressure wave moves through the water, it will eventually come through and it will enter in that little channel there, that pore, go into the channel, and that pressure wave will hit that cupola there. It'll hit it. It'll move it just a little bit. And when it moves it just a little bit, the fish is now able to detect that there's something going on the right side of the body. And it will bend its body accordingly to it. So if there's something going on over here, I'm snapping my fingers, there's sound waves coming in on this side. It's actually going to cause the body to go like this, and bend toward that, especially in predators. It will cause the body to bend toward that sound signal. Now, if you're an emerald shiner in the Ottawa River and there's a muskie swimming through the water and it's causing vortices and it's creating disturbances and there's pressure moving in front of its head as it's barreling in on your tiny little emerald shiner frame, if that emerald shiner detects that incoming pressure wave from this side, it's actually going to bend away. It's going to bend away, and it's going to shoot off in the opposite direction. So prey species and predator species actually have kind of slightly different behavioral reactions to certain sound stimuli. So it's something to sort of keep in mind as we think about sound. But here's what I was talking about earlier. As fish swim through the water, they will leave behind them a bunch of vortices, little turbulence that gets created as their tails swish side to side like that. They create these little vortices that shed off of and away from their bodies. And it's kind of like a breadcrumb trail. You can really think of it kind of like that. If there's a muskie and he's swimming along and he comes into contact with a trail of sort of dissipating turbulence from these fish, from these prey fish that are swimming around, they may actually be able to turn and follow those pressure waves to the source, i.e. the actual prey themselves. So, these pressure waves are going to be pretty quiet, though. They're going to be pretty quiet because as a prey fish, you're not going to evolve to create lots of noise in your environment. You're going to evolve to create pretty, minimal amounts of noise as you move through the water. Now generally speaking, we have kind of two categories of fish hearing. We can kind of group fish into what we call specialists, and we can kind of group fish into what we might call generalists. So your specialist hearing species would be things like carp and channel catfish. So these are species that are really sensitive to noises in their environment. Now think about where these two species tend to live. They tend to live on the bottom. They tend to live, maybe in deeper water. I mean, you can find carp up pretty shallow too, but especially catfish, you'll often find them in like deep holes. So deep, quiet areas. If there's some food moving around on the bottom, they're going to need to be pretty aware of what's going on and sensitive to little noises. Now, something like perch or walleye, for example, these would be classified as more generalist hearers. They're much less sensitive to noise. It requires more sound input for them to actually be able to detect something going on in their environment. Okay. And that's probably a function of the habitats that they live in, maybe just a little bit noisier. So do muskies hear well underwater? Okay, I just rambled on about a bunch of cool biology stuff, but you guys are like, okay, just cut to the chase. Do muskies hear well underwater? And the bottom line is we kind of don't really know specific to muskies, like much of what we know about muskies. We actually kind of have to infer it from other species. Fortunately, pike are really well studied and they're super closely related to muskies. And what we do know about pike is that we know that they're actually moderately good at sensing sound, especially at higher frequencies. And that it should be of some relevance to you as anglers in terms of what kinds of lures we put into the environment that might trigger a reaction from a fish. The fact that they are moderately sensitive to hearing, but not super sensitive, may be a function of their role as predators, and that they're more sensitive to sound, and because they're more sensitive to sound, they can find prey a bit more easily. But also, we don't see that they're like the most sensitive fish, and that's probably a function of the fact that they're apex predators. They ain't got much to worry about. And I would probably predict that muskies would be a little less sensitive to noise than pike, because we know pike they cannibalize often, and so other pike within a river system will be a formidable threat to a lot of other pike within a system. We don't see the same kind of cannibalism in muskies, so they may be a little less sensitive to having to detect like other pike or muskies, because they don't really have to worry about that as much. Now, of course, the age-old question, is it okay to play music? And my answer would be yes, as long as it's not country. But But I have to say that one of my all-time favorite songs is a Brad Paisley song. I'm gonna miss her, so don't send me that hate mail, guys.
Too late.
And I have a funny story about that Brad Paisley song, but we're not gonna go into it today. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I really wouldn't worry too much about the noise created if you play music in the boat. I think my dad's listening. Hey, Dad. He and I have video footage of me releasing a 48-incher, and in the background is CCR's version of "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," and it's like a 13-minute song or something. And that fish didn't care that I've caught lots of fish with music playing in the background, Cubs games playing in the background. So I don't think it really matters too much. You also think about the fact that your speakers are going to be above the carpet of your boat. Then the sound has to move through the carpet and then get to the metal or fiberglass of the boat and then get transferred to the water. So by the time that happens, it's probably going to be a bit muffled. So I don't think it's as big of an issue. So anecdotally, I have to say that I don't think it really spooks fish. Maybe it's an issue in clear water. It's possible that in clear water, the fish are just going to be that much more sensitive to kind of any disturbance in the water. But something like, the Ottawa River, which is, fairly stained, I'm not too concerned about it. And then the other question. So I had two questions. One was about this. Is it okay to play music while fishing? The other is, does our sound disturb muskies? And this is actually probably a pretty good segue into kind of what we're going to talk about, I think, for a majority of the show now with John. But one of the things that I think that we can say is that it might affect or disturb muskies in some instances. And in other instances, maybe not, and that it may have to do with kind of individual fish. And John alluded to that earlier, that some fish might be affected by it and some might not be affected by it. And we can talk about fish personality a little bit later. We can go down that rabbit hole. I'm happy to do that. But there have been some studies done which actually looked at like angler pressure and boat activity and boat noises and the sound of lures hitting the water and being retrieved through the water relative to pike. And they didn't really find that those noises and that kind of angling pressure really affected pike behavior. They didn't increase their activity. They didn't like move to another place in the lake. So on and so forth. So I think it maybe affects them a little bit, but I think on the whole, they're going to be a lot more tolerant of our presence than we expect. And I certainly have some stories I can tell about tracking muskies in the Ottawa and Rideau rivers and basically being like literally right on top of them and literally in some instances being able to see them and moving around with the electric motor, and having a sonar on. And electric motors and sonars can create quite a bit of noise underwater. So here's a fun dinner party fact for you before we close out this segment. So for all of you that have kids and your kids may be at, Daddy, Mommy, do fish fart? Do fish fart? Well, actually, fish do fart. Or more technically, they furt. Fast, repetitive tick. And this is what a fish fart sounds like. So there you go. All the things you were curious about, but always afraid to ask. There you go. Now you know. At least in Pacific herring, they definitely do these fast, repetitive ticks, aka farting. So yeah, if you've got more questions, please send them to John. You can send them to me too. I enjoy reading the questions that you all have, and I'm looking forward to answering more of your questions in the future.
Wow, that was so deep, and I learned so much every time you talk, Sean. Fish farts was something I've never contemplated before, actually. So just some deep learning right there. Lisa, if you want to throw up some questions in a moment or two, I'll throw a couple of comments back on all of what Sean just said, then we'll go deal with that great question that's up there right now. On fish sound, Tony Grant and Greg Thomas, the guys who produce Muskie Hunter magazine. Tony is the wild man in the muskie world. There is no question about that, and those stories are legendary. But he is also one of the very smartest guys in the muskie world. And I was in Pittsburgh a bunch of years ago, and I watched Tony put a video up that he filmed off of the dock in Cave Run, Kentucky, of a school of gizzard shad. And the noise that school of fish made through the microphone blew my mind. I could not believe that there was that much sound coming out of a school of fish, and way louder sound than you could imagine. And that was just picked up off of a little tiny camera microphone. So it leaves you to think right there. And you touched on how far you can see versus how far sound travels, and especially in a quiet environment. So, if somebody's hungry or thinking about it, or the sound of a school of bait fish making noise is a Pavlov's dinner bell, and that sound's traveling a long way, that's going to bring fish to it right there, guaranteed. And, the quieter your system gets, nighttime, low boat traffic times than ever, the more that sound has an impact as well. I wanted to mention a study, and I can't recall the specifics of it, but it was a lot of years ago. It was in Minnesota, and they actually covered fish's eyes and threw baits at them. And the fish, it was a lateral line study, and 19 out of 20 fish strikes on baits were still muskies hitting the bait in the head. Not only did they find the bait, but muskies always want to hit their prey in the head. If you don't grab it by the head, it's got a much bigger chance of getting away from you. So they want to grab it by the head, turn it, and swallow it head first. So, the fact that you can do that using only a lateral line, I mean, that's another study that just stuck with me.
I don't know if it's the same study that you're thinking of, but if it is, it happens to be one of my favorite studies, because it kind of blends my interest in science and my love of fishing. I actually have it pulled up on my computer here because I was just emailing someone else, one of your viewers, who had asked a question kind of related to this. But yeah, they basically blinded muskies. They were trying to figure out what role does vision play versus the lateral line. And like, when are they used within the whole strike sequence? And they knocked out the lateral line in some of these muskies. They blinded some of the muskies, and then left the lateral line intact. And basically what they found was, even when you blind a muskie, they still have a really high capture efficiency. The difference is that they initiate the strike at much closer distances, which makes sense. If they're not able to pick it up with their sight, then they have to feel it, and it needs to be that much closer for them to finally do something about it. Whereas with the vision, they can pick up that prey, they can make the initial stalk, and then when they can initiate the strike and make last second adjustments with their lateral line, which is what the article said. So vision and lateral line play a really big, important role in how muskies hunt. They work hand in hand together, for sure.
Wow. And we're going to come back to this and the importance of these facts, and talking about brown water. We'll get to that in a little bit. I see a question up there from Rob Dykins again. Rob's always asking questions. Thanks for being here every week and your participation, Rob. I can't read that question because I'm off my phone, Sean. And
that's all right. I can do that. Yeah. It says settle along. The reason I'm holding up a pacemaker, because this relates to the question. Settle a long-standing argument for me. Splashing down a large topwater lure. Why do some people say it spooks a potential fish, while it's not uncommon of getting an immediate strike? Is it a reaction? Is it just a reactionary strike? I would think that if I toss this pacemaker out, it hits the water, boom, and I have a fish smash the bait, that's just a reactionary strike. That is a fish that happened to be in the right spot at the right time, and they're a predator, and they see the chance to strike and get an easy meal that just happened to plop into the water. And I think that's all it is. You may have some individuals that say, like in clear water, where these fish are going to be a little more, wary of their environment. It's easier for ospreys and herons, to see down in the water, and so there's greater threat from above, and so something splashing in the water might very well be a potential, death sentence for the fish, right? But in something like the Ottawa River, where it's a lot dirtier, the water tends to be a lot dirtier. Stuff falling into the waters, chances are, unless you're an osprey hunting in 2 feet of water or 1 foot of water or something, it's probably not going to be much of a threat to you, and they're just going to lash out and grab the bait with a strike. The reason that I actually had this sitting next to me here was because I was going to show this to you when I talked about the higher frequencies, muskies and pike, actually specifically pike. But I think it's safe to extrapolate to muskies being a little more sensitive to higher frequency vibrations. A bait like the pacemaker or something like it. I think Big Mama Lures, I think they make their version of a tail bait with a clicker. That clicking noise is fairly high frequency, as opposed to my voice, which is quite a bit lower in frequency. And so a bait like this might actually work really well and actually be able to play into some of the muskies' kind of innate abilities of picking up or having a preference for higher frequencies underwater.
Well, interesting points. Musky Mama Twisted Sister Clicker is one of my very favorite baits, on the Ottawa. And I use that one because it's an American bait and not a lot of people around here have Musky Mamas. You can get them from Stacy Ash at Pro Tackle in Belleville. And that clicker element, again, the pacemaker, the Twisted Sister clicker, there's not a lot out there like that. So there's a little bit of magic, giving away some guide and biology secrets. And you've caught a muskie or two on that pacemaker, Sean.
Actually, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking to myself, I think this might have only actually caught one fish. It happened to be 52 inches, but I have some other pacemakers that have done pretty well. But this was one of Ty Sennett's first pacemakers. I remember I had him rebuild the bait, but it certainly moved its fair share of fish. And we caught my fishing partners and I this year caught some. Actually, it was my fishing partners that caught several fish on the Ottawa on a pacemaker. So they're a bait that works. Anything that clicks like that is a topwater bait. Kind of gets preferential treatment from me anyway.
Yeah, I had some of Ty's pacemakers the first year that he had them out as well. He had that beautiful a whole bunch of Paisley models.
Yeah,
they look like designer shirt or suits.
Yeah,
and they caught fish.
Yeah.
One other comment on landing on a fish's head. Does it scare them away? As a guide, one of the best ways to catch a 50-inch fish is to land on its head, because you initiate a reaction strike. Muskies are the Marines. There are fish that run from that sound because they're afraid, because it spooks them. My experience is a muskie's not afraid of anything. A muskie is the Marines. When there's trouble, when there's a noise, they go right there. So if you land on their head, a lot of times the reaction is turn and grab that before they get a chance to think it through. So that reaction strike will trick a big experienced fish, which is a much harder fish to catch than a less experienced fish. Absolutely. Lisa, do you have another deep question for us on sound? Anything else that came in that you thought we should handle? What do you got there, Sean? Print's too small for my eyes.
Doesn't look like a sound question. Has to do with what are the differences between a Flashabou inline and the actual bucktails behind you, John, on the right? Do you employ one or the other during different conditions or weather, or do they more or less do the same thing?
Between a Flashabou bucktail and a marabou inline?
Flashabou inline and actual bucktails.
And actual bucktails.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that there's a huge difference, especially at different times. When you consider that there is low noise in the environment, subtle sound distinctions become much bigger tools for you to trick muskies with. In late August, and we're going to talk about that, your fish have been in the same place for a long time. They know every bait that you throw at them. They know when you show up on the spot. They know how you fish. And if you throw the same baits over and over and over, or you throw the baits that every other fisherman shows up with, they learned that. They ate that twice already and last year, and it was a bad idea. And so they don't want anything to do with it. So that's when you need things that are different. And so I was going to say on this later, we have, I don't want to find them now, but to offer different signatures in the water, we mix blades, mag 10s and 8s, and that puts off a different profile than everything else. That produced like crazy for us. We designed the Sonics with a high frequency bell, and I had never heard anybody explain the high frequency angle like you just did, Sean. We designed that with a high frequency bell, again, to emit a different sound. And for me, I use a lot of regular inlines early and on spots, and then as my fish get more experienced, I'm going to things that they haven't heard. I'm going to my Sonics. I'm going to baits that have offset blades. I'm going to a hybrid, which again we built to offer a different signature. It's the same flashaboo that your inlines have, but this configuration of blades is a whole different vibration. The structure of this, a whole different sound pattern as well. And the more experienced your fish get with sounds, the more they pattern them, and the more important it is for you to be different. You know, whether it's everybody's throwing that bait, whether it's the time of year, you know, being different is a really good thing in general. And again, marabou, the sound of a whole lot of flash, 16-inch versus 32nd inch versus marabou in the water, totally different signatures to fish. So all of those subtle differences, they get big for experienced fish. And, you know, pressure changes everything. And fish learn through negative and positive experiences, you know, so be different. It's always good. Always good.
For sure.
If there's a last sound question, throw it up now, Lisa. And if not, we're going to move on to pressured water.
Outboard motor sound or electric motor sound, what would frighten a muskie more? Boy, I don't know. I've had muskies hit my electric trolling motor prop. So my understanding is that electric motors tend to be a little louder than gas motors. I'm not sure if I could point you to a source that actually confirms that, but honestly, I don't know. I've had fish hit my trolling motor propeller before. So it's like, I had that happen this year. I had it happen about 10 years ago. You know, I've had this discussion with boat partners before, especially on Lake of the Woods, where, you know, the fish there, like if I go up to Lake of the Woods, I'm actually not really expecting to catch fish, especially catch fish out on the cast. I am expecting to catch fish, but just not out on the cast. I'm usually actually expecting to catch fish right at the boat, especially if I'm throwing bucktails. And I remember having a debate argument, I don't know what you want to call it, with one of my boat partners once when I was running the trolling motor up at the front. He has a fish come in, turns in the figure 8, and I'm like, you know, still concentrating on where am I going with the boat. And I got the trolling motor on, and he realized I got the trolling motor on, and he starts yelling at me, but hey, turn the trolling motor off. I got this fish here. What are you doing? And, you know, then I was like, it's not going to affect it. And then, yes, it will. No, it won't. Yes, it will. And we got in this big argument about it. You know, but again, then I've had fish that come up and whack the propeller. So, you know, and I've also had the trolling motor on and fish follow and follow and follow and follow and follow and then hit while the trolling motor is still on and running continuously. So, you know, I just think that, they're apex predators, and they are the, they don't got anybody else to worry about other than, maybe a bigger muskie. And I think that it's gonna take a lot to really spook a fish. So yeah, I'm not too concerned about boat and propeller noise, be it from the electric motor or from the gas motor. And I know, like, I was looking in the comments just now, I've heard stories about, folks that get real quiet and they go right up to the reef. They throw an anchor out on one end, they throw an anchor out on the other. They turn every electronics, all the electronics off. They go dark. And they sit there and they wait. They're real quiet. They whisper. Everybody's whispering. And then, they start casting, and they swear by that, right? But, then I've been in areas and, I can hear like Metallica and Tool blasting from like, 300 yards away, and these guys, and I'm seeing with their fishing rods, and they're playing the air guitar and they're stomping around, and and then I come back to the dock at the end of the day and they caught a bunch of fish. So it's like, I don't know. It's a good question.
Next time your friend argues with you, Sean, just say, hey, did you see the doctor here in front? Because I study fish. That'd be my
anything. The older I get, the longer I have my PhD, I realize that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't.
No. Well, you know what? It means a lot to me, and the fact that you combine formal education with fishing experience. That's the magic combination for me, and a marriage of those two knowledge sources. To study fish is, I think, what you need. In terms of motors, I've had my electric motor hit a lot of times, like Sean, so it doesn't mean anything to those fish. When underwater cameras first came out, there was a guy on Lake of the Woods who ran a camera off the corner of his boat and beside his 9.9 kicker. And every day, whether he caught fish or not, and most times or a lot of days he didn't catch fish, but every day he had a fish come in and look at his 9.9, come right in behind it and sit and stare at the prop. And what are you doing in my lake? What are you doing in my river? Because I own this place. So that no fear factor, that's big. And then Sean's story about shutting everything off in silence. The bass guys do that more and more these days. The tournament guys, and they're fishing for a lot of money. Money's a big motivator to learn. Not catching fish as a guide, a huge motivator, to learn. And the bass guys are swearing by this. So, maybe there's something there. The first study we ever did in '94, the first telemetry study on the Ottawa River, Hedrick, Hedrick, we're both huge Hedrick fans in Ottawa, one of the smartest muskie observers, and such a great fisherman, a great teacher. But in that first telemetry study, it was old-fashioned transmitters, so we were out, people were out following them around with antennas, and most of the fish, like you said, you could get right up close to and say, the fish is right there. But there were several of the giant fish in that study that you couldn't get close to. And, they've lived their 20 some years. They've had a whole lot more negative experiences. And for whatever reason, you can speculate all you want. And that's what we do as muskie fishermen. They didn't want to be near the boat.
Yeah.
They associated the electric, the frequency of the radio waves. They associated us with bad. And so, there's a noise component to that for sure. So Sean, did you ever have any fish? You said you could drive right up beside a bunch of them. Did you have any fish that you couldn't get close to in PNB in your Project Noble Beast study? You remember that?
I don't recall. So like you mentioned, I think that was the Bernard Lebeau study where he was sort of chasing the muskie, go one end, they go the other, and they go the other. I don't really recall that happening with fish that we were tracking for Project Noble Beast. I also don't remember spending like a ton of time really trying to like get right on top of a fish. I do recall being able to look down and there's the fish. I can see the transmitter on its back. I'm literally, a foot above the fish, and it's just not moving. But I don't remember having fish that were like particularly hard to locate. No.
Okay. Wow. I could sit and talk about sound for hours, and that's a problem that we have on this show. Is musky heads we just go back and forth and just keep talking, and we do have some other really cool topics that we need to get to today, just to fulfill the promises that were made. So we're going to move on to pressured.
Yeah.
What does fishing pressure do? And I'm going to ramble at you for a second and just talk about pressure, some pressure considerations, and then we'll break up different types of pressure and introduce more of your audience questions, your listener questions at that point. So
awesome.
How important is pressure to me as a guide? Pressure changes everything. It's the third time I've said it in this broadcast. I spend my life mitigating pressure on the water. I run away from pressure. I think about it every day when I go fishing. I teach my guides to think about it. I tell them, to leave pressure, to get away from it. And if you're going to deal with it, how to deal with it. It is an all-encompassing thought for us. I think in terms of what pressure does to a population, pressure educates a population. Pressure gives fish far more negative experiences every time they're caught to learn from. Increased pressure means increased handling, means increased mortality. So in Canada, where our fish are completely no stocking, natural reproduction, natural recruitment in the system, lessening that population through something like pressure and handling errors has a much bigger effect on our all wild, strongest, biggest, best populations on the planet. Pressure in Ohio, where they can raise a 48.5-inch fish in 5 years and almost all the muskies are stocked, that's completely different. If you destroy a population from overfishing, from pollution, from negative influences, that's okay. You can rebuild 30-inch fish in 3 years, 40-inch fish in 4 years, and you fix it. You destroy it up here, you lessen it, you change the balance in a system. Fixing that is a long-term fix. Undoing the damage that you did, maybe never. And so that's the stuff that we're learning right now. So how we deal with pressure, it's an everyday consideration for guides. And we fish the fish, but we also fish the fishermen. And so it's another consideration in looking at pressure. And as a guide or an angler, you have to understand both. And that's why on this show we talk so much about behavior. If you learn spots, great, you got some spots. Pressure's going to kill your spots. It's not like more fish come off of a spot. If I fish a spot, X amount of fish come off it. 2 more people fish it a lot. There's a few more fish come off of it. Now that fish catch is divided by 3. 10 or 15 more people fish it. Now that fish catch is a little bit bigger, but it's divided by 10 or 15. So pressure changes everything on a spot in terms of how you address it, how you protect it, and how you fish it going through times. And that's why most good musky people will tell you they're nomads. I fished from above Manotick on the Rideau last year. I fished in downtown Ottawa. I fished in Montreal. I fished the St. Lawrence at Cornwall. And a big part of that is because I don't like people that much. And that's a common expression that guides say. I don't want to fish around people. And my fishing experience, which is way more important as I get older, I want to fish on my own. I want to fish away from people. I want to mitigate pressure, and that's a way more enjoyable day. So running away from pressure, I seek that. I know the negative influences I have, and I still know how to catch fish in pressured water because I've dealt with it for years and years and years. But a lot of general anglers and people who go and learn spots, hey, we learned those spots. We know those now. That'll serve you right now. But when you tell your friends and they tell their friends, that spot's just going to get harder and harder and harder. So if you don't learn the behavioral component, if you don't learn to deal with that pressure, it's going to affect your fishing. So, God, I have so much more to ramble on, but I don't want to be that guy. And so I want to ask you, Sean, how does a fish learn? What do biologists think about that word learn? Can you comment on that?
I can, and I'll also Jordan Weeks, who's also a biologist. There you go. Who's also a biologist in Wisconsin. A lot of you in the audience may know Jordan's name. He writes for Musky Hunter. He sits on the Saga Technical Committee. He's a pretty famous biologist fisherman. Humbled that Jordan's in the audience here, probably fact checking me as I talk. And he asked the same question. And there is evidence to support the fact that fish actually can learn. In fact, in some cases, can learn tasks faster than other vertebrates can, like other mammals. So there is evidence to suggest that fish have a greater cognitive ability than perhaps we give them credit for. For me, I think that I am torn between calling how a muskie might change their behavior over time or with pressure learning or habituation or conditioning. And I think that at times it's a function more of their kind of becoming conditioned to boat noise. And so, for example, we had a fish in Project Noble Beast caught on one of the most well-known community spots on the lower Ottawa River. And that fish was caught on a double 10. And I think over the next few years, it was caught 3 times. Yeah, you may have caught it 3 times. I was going to say 4.
I caught it the second time.
Okay. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know what fish I'm talking about. It's like a 48-incher. And I think every time it was caught on double 10s from the same piece of structure. And when we would track it for the study, it was on the same piece of structure. Again, it's a community spot. And we would track it all the time to this one location. And to think that a fish like that is getting conditioned. They're conditioned to the fish, or they're conditioned to the fishermen that are around all the time. And this really, to me, this gets to individual differences in personality within a population. Mm-hmm. And some of you are like, what? He said one too many IPAs tonight. He's out here talking about on left field, talking about fish personality. But personality is an increasingly popular field of study within general animal behavior research and science, and especially related to fish. I actually engaged in a study to look at personalities of rainbow smelt, of all things, when I was doing my PhD in Prince Edward Island. And what we know from the literature is that there are many instances in fish, in bugs, in birds, in mammals, of animals having distinct personalities. They exist on a spectrum, and typically we talk about them in the context of, and this is relevant to anglers, but we typically talk about them in the context of bold and shy behaviors or personalities. So think type A versus type B. Some individuals are going to be more tolerant, i.e. risk takers, of lots of noise, of the same potential threats in an area. They're going to be more tolerant of that. Others are going to be a lot less tolerant. And I think those fish, especially with muskies, I think those are the ones that are out in the basin. Those are the ones out in the pelagic open water environments. Those are the ones that are away from the shallow water, because I hate trolling. I can't cast a bulldog into 30 feet of water with no structure. I'm going to be up shallow, and that's where probably the vast majority of people listening to this program are going to be fishing. For the most part, they're going to be in shallow water. And I think there's some individuals that are going to hang out there all the time. And I think there's some individuals that are going to be way out in the abyss. They're not going to have anything to do with that shallow water stuff. There's plenty of food out in the abyss. And maybe occasionally they'll come in shallow. But I think it really speaks to angling pressure really is going to show us which fish have what personalities. And I think when we have periods of time when we're fishing where it's like there's lots of pressure day in and day out, lots of people on every spot that we see, and it's so freaking hard to catch a fish, why won't all these people just go away? I think what you're starting to see are the shy individuals starting to show up more often. Like we don't catch them, they're around, but the bold fish have just been caught. And there's going to be a period after being caught where they're going to probably be kind of wary of that negative experience, Pavlov's dogs and conditioning and negative reinforcement. They're going to want to avoid those sounds and those things that they're now associating with that bad experience. Then eventually those same individuals are going to get hungry again, and then we're going to catch them again. And so this has been hypothesized in the pike literature about, fish that seemingly are really difficult to catch. So you've got catch rates that decline, and then suddenly those catch rates come back up again, even when there's still, pressure around. So that's why you still continue to catch fish off of community spots.
Wow. This is just like a ping pong game, Sean. I hear you. I'm writing stuff down, just back and forth. So the fact that Jordan Weeks is here listening from Wisconsin, that is so cool. Jordan came up at Pete Mayna's presentation for the Hamilton chapter this past week. Just a monster biologist, again, contributed so much. I can't believe you're here, Jordan. That is so cool. And I need to throw a shout out to Joel Maxim and Maxim Outdoors in Wisconsin, who's writing me and telling me he's listening to this, and to Sheriff Chris Dobbins, one of my best friends from Wisconsin, who I've had the pleasure of fishing with for a lot of years. And Robert Mason, who's listening to this from Glasgow in Scotland. We drank all the scotch on the bar when I was in Scotland a couple of years ago with Robert. He's come here and fished with me. So we're getting people from Musky John from Jacksonville, Florida, people from Texas. I got people from California, Wisconsin, Illinois. So if you're out there listening to this, say hello right now, or with a comment, tell us where you're from, just so we get a better perspective. I got to go to Sean's comment on fish personalities. There are smart people and there are dumb people, and we all know some of each. And there are smart fish and dumb fish. And I've met some of both through time, and we'll talk a little bit about more about that. And Sean talked about it in terms of shy and bold. And that's a really good way to listen to it. As a guide, I get to fish with an incredible array of teachers, biologists, guides who fish all over the musky world, people who run fisheries for different states, researcher, just an incredible chance to learn. A guy named Don Dewey. I had so much fun fishing with Don over the years, rest his soul. Don was a BASS pro. And again, the bass guys study way more than us musky guys, because they're fishing for pride like us, but they're fishing for money, and money's a big motivator. So Don told me a story once a long time ago, and I never forgot this, and I used this. And he said, John, there's two kinds. Don's from West Virginia. Don said, John, there's two kinds of fish in the system. There's Ralphies and there's Georgies. And Don had a whole lot of ponds and fish tanks that he kept fish in. And he studied bass and bass behavior. And he did all kinds of his own experiments. And he said, the Ralphies, he said, I show up at the side of the tank with a colored bucket and they know it's feeding time. And he said, all the Ralphies, he said, you can tell the Ralphies, they come running. It's Pavlov's bell. It's the dinner bell. And they know they're going to get fed. And so all the Ralphies come. And he said, those are the ones that are easy to catch. Those are the ones that get caught over and over. And he said, but the Georgies, he said, if you want to win big fish in a tournament, you need to catch a Georgie. And he said, a Georgie isn't like any of the Ralphies. He said, you watch, you show up, the Ralphies come to you, and the Georgie slides away quietly and hides behind the log. It hides behind the rock. It might sit and watch what you're doing from a distance. It doesn't come anywhere near you. It knows you're bad news. It's the shy fish. And he talked about breaking down those behaviors, you know, the same way that you did. And this is a West Virginia bass fisherman looking at fish in his pond, talking exactly the same way you do, Sean. You know, we all want to learn that, you know, that same thing. So the big muskies, they're the Georgies for me. They're exactly like you said. They've had 25 years of learning in Canada. And again, you know, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, their fish live to 13 or 14 years. And they're done. They're dead at that point. Our Canadian fish live to 30 years. They grow so much slower. They have that much more time to associate negative experiences, to learn. And that's where your trophies are. That's why people, you know, some of the most experienced guys I know, they shut off. They fish in silence. They fish in stealth. They do everything to be quiet. You know, and so what an interesting debate to have. Project Noble Beast, Sean, 53 fish transmitted, tagged, and followed for the year. How many recaptures in that year?
We had 30 fish that we transmitted for the catch and release stuff specifically, and then I did another study where we tagged another 13, so 43 total. And I want to say, you know, we had emailed about this earlier, and I meant to look it up in my data. I want to say it was like half a dozen, maybe, if that, like maybe 5. There were a couple of fish for the acoustic telemetry study that got recaptured, and so if you don't include those, we're looking specifically at the catch and release stuff on the Ottawa. Yeah, it was probably like 3. It was very, very small number of fish that were recaptured. I mean, wow. The populations of muskies are really, really small. I mean, you and I were with Gord and Wally. We were just emailing about this, right? And the number of fish, the density of fish in systems where muskies are present is really low. Like you know, a pretty good body of water might be only 1 fish for every 5 acres of water. So 0.2 fish for every acre. You know, maybe up to half a fish per acre, or maybe 1 fish per acre. That would be on the really high end of things. Because if you imagine, like, you got, you know, a lake like Lake St. Clair, it's 275,000 acres, and 1 fish per acre would be like 275,000 fish. I don't know if there's 275,000 fish in Lake St. Clair, even though there's a lot of fish caught, you know, all the time. But that's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of variables in there. Maybe we don't need to go into that right now, but I wanted to mention that because you mentioned earlier about like the importance of pressure and handling and, you know, added pressure on a water system. And, you know, we could talk about like added COVID pressure and what that's done to our water bodies. But I might as well take a moment to just sort of underscore the importance to the audience of like how essential it is that we handle the fish properly. And not only that, but that we teach other people that are new to the sport how to handle them properly. Because think about that. If a good body of water has about one fish for every 5 acres of water, that's not a lot of fish in the water, in a water body. Okay. And so, we lose a spawning fish that has ramifications for the population. Maybe not tremendous, maybe not the loss of one fish, but you compound that over, the loss of several fish due to bad handling, and that could be pretty problematic. So, yeah.
Huge topic, and that the population ramifications. I'm just going to go. Pete Mena guested at the Hamilton chapter meeting this past week. I took 8 pages of notes off of that meeting. Again, phenomenal chance to learn at a Muskies Canada meeting, people. You should write this down. You should go and join. You can do this over and over. I tried to get Pete to bring up a story that he told me when we were out in the boat together a long time ago, and he didn't recall it, because he's telling stories his whole life. But to me, he told this story, and I can tell it word for word. He talked about a pond on his father's land. It's a 10-acre lake, a little lake. He said they stocked it with a bunch of muskies. He said they threw a bunch of fish in there, and then they kind of forgot about it. And he came back a few years later after they'd grown up a little bit, and he said he threw a cast out in that pond. And he said the first cast that he threw, he watched his bait come back to the shore. And none of those fish had seen a lure. And he said the first fish near that bait, he said it tried to eat that bait 6 times, coming between the time it hit the water and the time it was coming to the shore. It hadn't hunted that, it hadn't seen it, but it just knew this was moving and it was food. And it did everything it could to eat it. And he said then they learned not to hit it slowly. They were more resistant to hitting that bait, and then they wouldn't hit it. And then they had to go to different baits. And the same thing, they learned at first they hit it readily, and then they learned not to hit it readily. And it got, so that they wouldn't hit anything except live suckers after a while. They knew the bait game. They knew they were being hunted. Sucker fishing is a dirty word in Canada because there's a real mortality rate associated with that. So most people don't do that up here. If you do, kudos to you. You need to really take special precautions like a quick strike rig and set the hook quick. But, thank goodness that's not a common tactic here. But that story and what fish learn and what fish that haven't seen lures do just stuck with me for a long time on that. So I wanted to get that one out. And on fishing pressure in Wisconsin and where pressure goes to, Wisconsin, again, a lot of stocking, so the damage that you do affects your populations in the short term. You can fix that. You can't fix that on a naturally recurring population. So I contributed to a chapter in a book last year. It's the Orvis Guide to Musky Fishing. It just came out, a long time guide. Kip Veith wrote this book, and Kip and I talked, and I watched pressure increase every year here for 3 decades, and musky fishing is really popular. Fishing is really popular. Kip told me about fishing his version of pressure, and he drift fishes a lot of Chippewa flowage area rivers. They fish a lot of small lakes. So he said the guides, and he did a bunch of calculations, and they came up with numbers that there are fish on the rivers they drift and in the small lakes that get fished a lot. And Wisconsin makes over $1 billion a year off of musky tourism alone, but they estimated there were fish that see lures for 12 to 14 hours per week in peak season. Can you imagine? So, for me here, the fish that are sitting on the community spots, I can't imagine how many times they've seen a flash of boot inline by the time you get to the end of the year. And it's hundreds and thousands of times that fish watches that go by. The importance of being different gets driven home more and more. And where Kip goes with this pressure, he talks about the triple play. You got to go out on the triple play. Those fish know not to eat baits. They've all learned don't eat the common baits. You need a special presentation. You need to trick them at the side of the boat. Mostly you need to be there on peaks. You need to be there on the moon peak. You need to be there on the sun peak. You need to be there when two peaks are lined up. And his big trick is you need to be there when the moon is lined up with the sun, is lined up with a weather anomaly that are driving fish. And so the more experienced your fish get, the better your game has to be as an angler, and the more you need to address so many external factors. So thank goodness we are a long way from that in Canada, but it's coming. That evolution of pressure, it's all coming, and it all has an effect on your population. You have a comment or thought on that, just to break up my long ramble for a moment, Sean?
I mean, we live in a global pandemic right now, and so as I'm hearing talk about pressure and things, I can't help but think about the added pressure that I saw on the water this summer. And there were a lot of boats on the water, and I'm seeing stuff in the comments here. People are talking about how boat prices are crazy, availability is insane, you can't hardly get anything. Yeah, boat dealerships love right now. They love what's going on right now, but for everybody else, it's kind of hard if you were in the market for a boat. And there's a lot more boats out on the water. And two thoughts on that. First, I agree completely. You got to figure out another way to trip their triggers, because the fish are still there. It's just going to take something a little bit different. And I really don't like throwing bucktails anymore, especially double tens. And that's probably why I didn't catch any big fish this year, because I was so stubborn and was trying a lot of different things. But that trying to keep in mind some of the things we talked about today, in that sense, and trying to get a leg up on the fish is always a good idea. I mean, the other thing too is I have the same reaction I think a lot of people had when they saw a lot of the extra pressure this year, which was, oh man, really? At the same time, I think we have to step back a little bit and think about that this is a real opportunity to get people into the sport. And by the sport, I don't mean musky fishing particularly and specifically. I mean fishing in general. I look around and I see the diversity of anglers now all over the place, and it's awesome. And we as an angling community have complained for years about we're seeing declining participation in our sport, and that has a lot of ramifications for funding, for management, all sorts of implications for that. But we have a real opportunity to try and seize on this new influx of interested anglers. And I view it as a good thing. Initially, I was like, oh, man, I really wanted to go fish that spot over there. Oh, there's someone there. But, I think it really is a good thing. And also, for Canadian anglers, boy, if you haven't spent any time fishing in the States, you don't know what pressure's like. When I came here 10 years ago and got out on the Ottawa River for the first time with Hedrick Wachelka, and he picks out his binoculars and he's scoping in the distance and he's muttering under his breath. I'm going, I'm squinting my eyes going, what is he looking at? And I said, Hedrick, what are you looking at? And he goes, see that boat over there? And I squint my eyes a little harder and I finally see it about 2 miles away. And he goes, oh, the pressure. I can't believe it. This is crazy. You never see anyone out here. I'm accustomed to growing up in Illinois and fishing Lake Shelbyville and Lake Kincaid. And, there's 4 boats doing a ring around the rosy thing in one cove. Or I remember fishing Mille Lacs in the sand flats on the north end of Mille Lacs when that bite was lights out and everybody and their mother was up there just doing one of these, fishing in 2 to 4 to 5, 6 feet of water and just going round and round and round we go. So yeah, pressure, we have to deal with it. It's just part of the game.
Yeah. I look at it like you do. The fishing world has changed last year, and it'll change again this year. COVID pressure is a term that Pete Mena used. It's the first time I heard it at the meeting last week. I think the world of Pete, and I'd never thought of that. In Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, they had 400,000 new licenses sold last year. In Wisconsin, they had 600,000 new licenses sold. Muskie's a big fish there. That's 1 million extra fishermen. And so, Pete put it in perspective. His favorite lakes were way tougher to fish. But what he looked at was the longer term repercussions on the population. And so the important, all that new energy, looking at the resource and going, holy mackerel, discovering there's this incredible fish called a muskie that's so fast and so aggressive and so fun to fish. That is powerful, because when you have tourism dollars and people paying attention and people interested, that's when the research comes. That's when the protection for the research comes. And, and all these people caring is a really great thing. At the same time, it comes with the negative side of the responsibility to learn to handle, to learn to release, to learn to do a better job. And, Gord Pizer says so many wise things and has such a macro perspective. And Gord always says, you get exactly the fishery that you deserve as anglers. And other people with sensitive fish have gone to barbless hooks, to single hooks. In the trout world, if you're in Alberta and BC, you fish with single hooks for your trout and salmon, because those are fragile populations, and it's recognized. And in the muskie world, we fish for a fish that's going to go under more and more pressure with 9 hook points and 3 treble hooks. Is that a best practice? It's a best practice for catching. Is it a best practice for long-term fish populations? Are there better ways to take care of those fish? You know what? There are. Is there a mortality associated with all those hooks? Yes. Is there a mortality rate associated with catching? And so, the more we learn about fish, the more people that fish for them, the more we've got to take care of them. Absolutely. So COVID pressure. Thanks, Pete Mena. Outside the box, like you always are. Lisa, I don't even see any of the questions on here because I can't deal with the chat. I can't chew gum and walk at the same time. So do you have a question to throw up at this time? If so, go ahead and we'll deal with it. Okay. And a couple more comments before that comes up on pressure after I sort
there was one, John, there was one here. We didn't talk about brownouts. I think that was one of the things we were maybe going to chat a little bit about. You want to talk a little bit about brownouts? Yeah, there you go. That's the question I was thinking of. Yeah,
we talked about pressure. You and I are going into overtime. I try to keep this at 90 minutes, but you're too damn interesting, Sean. And I don't know if you and I talk if we'd be able to do this. And so, we'll try and cut it down. Tough condition fishing, blue skies, blue skies and high pressure, post frontal and low pressure, and brownouts. On the Ottawa River, our river is dynamic, and that's a really neat thing. You can fish different sections and find different conditions. You can find different conditions on different days. Brownouts are really tough. A lot of rain, turning our water to chocolate milk, zero visibility, a musky angler's nightmare, because we are visually oriented fishermen, just like muskies are a visually oriented predator. And when we can't see, it really throws muskie anglers off much more than it throws muskies off, I've come to learn. So what's the question on brown water, Sean, and what are your thoughts on that? And I'll throw a couple back at you.
Yeah, the question was in regards to high water flooding situations, what's your advice on this? My advice would be to really start paying attention to trying to exploit the natural sensory systems of the fish you're targeting in situations like that. So for example, we just talked about sound today. You know, I'd be thinking about throwing something that's got quite a bit of sound on it, whether it's rattles, maybe it's a jointed bait, clack, 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 clack. You know, the loudest topwater you've got, you know, a double-bladed something, right? The other thing too would be color. And so I haven't talked about this. I'm actually thinking about next week, maybe talking a little bit about color and vision in muskies. But without giving away too much about what that discussion might be about, one thing that I would maybe try and do in dirty water is to contrast the surrounding water with your bait. So if it's like real brown, muddy, you might go with something that is like really light in color, so like a white, for example. If the color of the water is like really chocolate milk, you know, with like quite a bit of lightness to it, you might go with something dark. So maybe go with like a black. So, you know, or you have some contrast. So maybe instead you do something like a dark orange with like a yellow. Which would offer that contrast of light versus dark, with the dark orange being the darker and the light yellow being that light. So I would just be thinking about, like, how can I make my bait and my presentation stand out to make sure that a fish has the best chance of picking up that bait in those less than ideal hunting conditions.
Really wise words. You said something earlier on brownout conditions. You talked about when a muskie can't see, how they need to be much closer to a bait before they engage in the strike. And so this is one that took me years and years and years to learn. And again, a Gord Pizer comment, fishing with Gord a bunch of years ago. Gord asked me about, you know, what's it like in that bay back there, John? And I said, I don't know, Gord, we don't go back there. He said, why was that? And I said, well, it's dirty water. It's brown. You can't see. And Gord just looked at me and said, really? And oh no. And it was, you know, it's like your grandfather, you know, sorry for the grandfather, Gord. It's like somebody very wise and more experienced than you saying, you know, you're really missing out on this. And from that moment on, I stopped fearing brown water like I did, and I started trying to embrace it. And just like you said, thinking about the fish's senses in terms of visibility, in terms of sound, and then for me, it was in terms of their ability to react and their ability to want to swim full speed. You know, do you run full speed when you can't see anything in the dark? Probably not a good idea. And so the same thing. And one of the best things that I have learned, I watch a lot of muskie fishermen, and they just fish the same way all the time. Yeah, I fished fast. I covered a lot of spots. I reeled really quick. And how'd you do in the brown water today? We didn't see anything. Never had a move. No kidding, because the fish can't react to the way that you always fished for them. Yeah. And so in the brown water, you need to slow down a lot, because the fish's ability to find your bait and to key in on it, and you answered another big question, and to want to strike, they have to get right there, and you have to let them get right there. Excuse me. And the other thing is on finishing at the side of the boat. Come in and you do your figure eight fast, and then you throw another cast. Well, you know, your fish didn't get close to your bait and didn't key in on it at the side of the boat. So your finish at the side of the boat is now much slower and much longer. And as you know, you have to have extreme confidence in dark water, because you don't see anything. And that's where you don't rely on a spot. you rely on what you learned as a behavioralist, which will serve you much better than just learning spots. And, we take our locals out and I tell them, said, do you see any people on this spot here? And they go, no. And I said, I've been to this spot with 1,000 people. Do you see any of them back? And that's because I try to explain to people that musky fishing isn't about learning someone else's spots and going and beating the heck out of it, because that will serve you, or in my learning curve, it serves you for a while and then you killed the spot and then it doesn't serve anybody. You are far better off learning, okay, this is the conditions, the barometer, the light, the turbidity in the water, the time of year, and put that puzzle together and address that. And then once you learn that, you can apply that knowledge. You can look at a map. You can look at Google Maps and that point, that weed bed, that bay is going to be out of the current, and now you can figure the puzzle out. If all you learn is spots, you only have a limited life before your spots change. And so, that behavior goes a long way.
Yep.
Lisa, if you have a question, throw it up. Otherwise, one of us is going to keep rambling here.
We got, I know that there is a question about how do algae blooms affect fish, which is a topic that I have some experience with fishing Lake of the Woods. For some reason, I'll frequently encounter, I'm only up there for like a week at a time. And we'll frequently encounter an algae bloom at some point during the trip. I was very fortunate this year to make the drive, the 24-hour drive with my wife out to Lake of the Woods, and was able to fish it this year. And I'm here to tell you, I was really glad we did it, because it was like a wilderness experience. It was unbelievable.
It is.
I will remember that trip for the rest of my life. But we encountered an algae bloom, and I'll be honest that I will usually just try and burn a bit more gas to find another location that doesn't have at least as much algae bloom. If I'm like reeling a bait in and I've got, algae, it's dripping off and I'm staining my pants, that's, to me, there's kind of a fine line between, enough to create kind of cover and mask, my movements and things in the boat, and so much that you can't see follows. It's going to be a lot harder for the fish to detect the baits. And but that said, the fish still have to eat, and I can move a lot faster in a 115 Yami than the fish can, for a sustained period of time. So I have the luxury of being able to move somewhere else, but they don't, which means they're still going to have to find a way to eat. And, I think it comes back to, again, exploiting the senses of the fish in those conditions. So loud, throwing lures that are loud. A lot of articles have been written in like Musky Hunter and other magazines about how do you deal with algae blooms, especially when you go to a place like Lake of the Woods. And, a lot of guys will say, throw a top rater, throw a prop style top water, create some noise, throw a big bladed bucktail, and slow down too. So, earlier when you were talking about the brownouts and having to slow down, it reminded me of fishing in Illinois, especially in the spring, early spring, especially down on lakes like Lake Kincaid, which has a pretty good glider bite in the early spring. And typically you get those early spring rains, the water's all nasty, and people are catching fish on gliders in dirty, 6-inch visibility water, if that. And they're slowing down, and those baits are just zigzagging back and forth at a nice slow pace, and they're whacking fish left and right on those baits. And I do think that sometimes it takes slowing down, or a bait that's reeled in a pretty straight line. So you don't want to maybe work a glide bait super fast and pop it back and forth through the water, but something like a rattle trap, which has a lot of noise to it. It's going in one line. It's going one straight line. So I think that there's just kind of like this little game of cat and mouse. You got to start to think. You got to get a little bit nutso and start thinking like the fish and try and exploit what you know about their biology. And hopefully, you know, through programs like this, you pick up some nuggets of wisdom that might help you on the water.
Well, not a big problem for a lot of musky guys to get nutso. We are one of the biggest groups of eccentrics in the fishing world. I need to go back to that flood question for a second, because we've had two super floods, 2017, 2019, and man, did that change things, wreck things in the spring. A lot of people tell you it was their toughest time fishing or ever. Wow, sadly I have audio problems. Hopefully that goes away.
I can still hear you. Sound like you're in a tin can, but I can still hear you.
Okay, as long as we can talk. And we'll figure this out. We've got new microphones coming for next week, everybody. So just gonna go Star Trek in the technology. In terms of flooding in the spring, the past couple of years, I'm gonna go back. Muskies wander when the water gets high. They tend to move and follow shoreline. So the higher the water goes, the more territory your muskies can be in, the harder it's going to be to find them. But they do tend to wander, and they really love the shallow water. We had a Muskies Canada outing on the lower Ottawa River, going back, I don't know, 15 to 20 years. It was an opening day outing. I got 4 fish that day in my boat. We came to the dinner. 3 of the fish that I had caught had toonie-sized chunks out of their back, right in front of their dorsal fin in the same place, this far apart. I've never seen that before. And they were serious marks. And I couldn't figure out what that was. And I asked around. You know, we all started talking about what'd you catch, how'd you catch it, where were they? You know, and you do some of the best learning at those dinners after the events. And there were a few other people caught these fish with these toonie-sized chunks out of their back. So what was it? Well, how did they get that? What it was, and it took me a while to figure it out, is in the brown water, the muskies seek out the warmth in the spring. They seek out the shoreline. And if your back is sitting out of the water in shallow water, that's in the sun, that's the most warmth you can absorb, and that increases your energy. The fish seek to do that in the spring. It helps them recuperate. It gives them more energy to hunt, so they really seek to do that. And the toonie-sized chunks were ospreys hunting the muskies. And the osprey would look down and see something this big in the water that they didn't realize was actually this big, and come down and hit it. Just like the eagles out west hit the salmon in the rivers, you know? And those ospreys would stick their talons in those fish and try and grab, and those talons are so sharp, and they can't hold on. They don't hold on. They learn not to hold on, or they're going to get dragged under, but they've made the mark and the scar. So brown water in the spring, go shallow, go really shallow. Lisa, do you have a picture of that giant fish? The Peter George, nope. That was a blue sky fish. Wally Robbins. We're never going to get to all the stuff that we talked about. We're going to talk about blue skies. This is one of my favorite guests of all time, Peter George. Peter was the president of McMaster University. He took McMaster and raised its profile over his almost 20 years there. He's a legendary man in the outdoors, on the executive for the Toronto Sportsman Show for years. Somebody who traveled all over the world to fish. And he is the closest I've ever seen to a Dos Equis man in Canada. The coolest man alive. Peter's like 76 years old, maybe 77, holding this fish that he caught casting. This is a July 9th fish on the Ottawa River. It is 55 inches by 24 and a quarter inches around in girth. Now, in the spring, muskies spawn, the big females like this one spawn, and then it takes them a while to recuperate. And so I'll tell you a non-scientific version about why this fish is 24.25 inches around on July 9th, when that girth is not supposed to exist. And I'll tell you, I can show you a boatload of fish pictures of fish with this girth in the spring. And it happens when certain conditions align. So on this year, we had a terrible cold spring. We had very high, very brown water. And so your muskies in a perfect world on the Ottawa spawn 2 weeks before the fishing season opens, which is how all of our seasons are designed in Canada, so that all of our muskies have a chance to spawn, and that spawn will be successful. So fish spawned and the water went brown and the water went high. And so what happens is your fish in the spring, there's a lot of fish moving around. They can't see. They all end up in off current spots. They all end up in low current, zero visibility locations, and all the fish end up together. All the bait fish and all the big muskies. And so picture everybody sitting in the brown water in really concentrated areas for a bunch of days in a row. And so the muskie is sitting, not moving, and dinner is right here all day long, 24 hours a day, or it just keeps showing up over and over and over if you don't move. And what you see on your fish finders in those situations is a screen that just looks like this, wall-to-wall fish. And so the muskies early in the year eat and eat and eat and eat before we find them, before we know how to find them, before we get a chance to fish for them. And that's how 24.25 inches happens on July 9th. And it's not an anomaly. It's just understanding behavior related to environmental conditions under exceptional circumstances. So, brown water.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, why go anywhere else than where the food is? So
yeah. And if you went from post spawn a month earlier, where a female muskie loses up to 1/3 of its body weight, because a fish that's about to lay eggs, 1/3 of that female's body, up to 1/3 of it, is eggs. And the recuperation from the process of expelling 1/3 of your body is that's a really fragile time for those fish. And then they go, they recuperate for a few days, and then the feed bag goes on. And so, if that feed bag goes on and dinner is right here for 2 or 3 weeks in a row, look out, magic happens.
Yeah, it's a pretty stressful time for them. So they would need to pack on the calories when they're in the period of spawning. They're not going to be doing a lot of chasing food around. They're going to be solely focused. I mean, when fish, sockeye salmon and stuff come into the rivers to spawn, they head up. They're not eating. And that period of time, fish are solely focused on the task at hand, and that is making babies. And when that's over, then they can shift their attention to actually eating. So that makes total sense, especially from a biological standpoint.
Yeah. I said we try to stick to 90 minutes, but I knew, before you and I started talking tonight, Sean, I knew that this was just going to be like this. And so I don't want to go on all night, but I do want to address one of the topics that we didn't get to that I promised that we would, and that was technological pressure. And so this concept has come home to me, and I think about populations, and I think about where it goes. And so in another life, I worked for IBM in the 90s. And since that time, I have tried not to learn anything about new technology. it's not my thing. I love the experience, but I'm a round peg in a square peg in a round hole, in that world. And the technology that I have learned is all for catching me more fish. Technology is changing so fast that new technology, year by year by year, as a guide or a muskie angler, if you learn the latest technology, you will catch more fish. It will show you so much that you never knew. And new technology gives people who weren't hunters. When I started this, there was no technology. I learned my first spots by lining up the end of an island with a birch tree over there and the dock at that cottage, and now I'm on the reef.
I still do
that. I still do too, but the way that people learn now is so different from how I started out, and even how you started out. And technology lets a whole new generation of people. There are people like Gord Pizer who you could set loose on any body of water anywhere in North America, and that guy is going to go catch more fish than you or me with no technology, because he just understands behavior, and he is a hunter. And so there are people in the fish world like Al Linder and Gord Pizer who know how to hunt. And hunters will teach you one thing, but technology lets people who aren't hunters, it lets a whole new generation of people who are technology nuts learn technology and fish through technology. And so you can not only find fish, you can find individual fish now. And so you can identify muskies. You can identify muskies on the bottom. And so when technology 15 years ago, we used to look at turtlebacks on the bottom. We called them turtlebacks because it was a hump with an air pocket underneath. And that turtleback, with that space that wasn't filled in, was an air bladder. And you could tell that big turtleback you were looking at wasn't a rock. It was a muskie or a sturgeon, and they have different shaped air bladders, but I'm not going to go into telling you how to tell the difference between those. But now you can spot a muskie laying on the bottom, or the big fish on the bottom. And that was 15 years ago. And I'm a technical idiot. But the past few years, I pick individual fish off the side of my boat. I can tell you what direction they're facing. I can tell you how far they are off the bottom, if they're glued to the bottom, if they're 6 inches off the bottom, if they're a few feet off the bottom. And for me, that tells me how active they are, how willing they are to move for fish. That one that's glued on the bottom, you need the newest technology to find that fish. And if it's glued, that fish doesn't want to move to chase a bait. If it's a little bit off the bottom, it's neutral and not negative. If it's a little more off the bottom, and we throw casts at it, and now I look at my technology and I read how the fish reacts. Did that fish move? Did it twitch? Did it run away? There's a whole lot of different learning. So technology allows people who could never find fish through hunting before, it allows them to find fish and hunt them. So I go to my talk with Kip Veith. A lot of Wisconsin lakes are small. You go to the boat launch, 50 people a day go to the boat launch, and they do the lake. And they go to bay number 1 and point number 1 and the weed bed after that and the pile of logs, and they do a lap of the lake because it's the logical way to fish. So I'm going to ask a question, and we got to sort this out ourselves as fishermen, okay? Is the technology good for the fish population? You need to manage that population, and if everybody can go and find those fish, If you go and find a schooling fish, that's one thing. If you go and find individual fish, an individual trophy fish, and so on a small Wisconsin lake, if all those fishermen have technology that lets them find an individual fish and they fish for it, and the fish is a creature of behavior and it lives in a specific location a lot of the time, is that ethical? Are you harassing a fish to death? Because if you keep throwing stuff at it, you will get close to it. If people throw baits at it for 12 or 14 hours a day, a fish doesn't have hands to push you away and say, get out of here. I hate you. You're evil. I know. A fish has a mouth, and how a fish deals with your bait is with its mouth or with its tail by leaving. And I have watched fish that I have harassed push my bait away. I have watched fish come to the surface with their mouth closed and steer my bait off a spot. And that is an experienced fish who doesn't want to deal with my bait. It knows, it knows it's bad. It knows it's bad for it, but that's all it's got is its mouth. And how a fish strikes a bait. You know, I look if a bait's in a fish's throat, in the side of its mouth, in the front of its mouth, on the outside of its mouth, and all of those statements mean a whole different thing to me about that fish's activity and what that fish was doing and why I caught that fish. And so, you know, a question we're going to have to answer as anglers really soon is our technology good for our fish? Is it good for maintaining the population of that fish? Is that technology combined with the 9 hooks, the 9 hook points that we throw at that fish, good in the long term? You know, and right now you can find individual fish, and the guys who are making the technology are going, man, what are we going to do next year? Can we put this technology in an underwater drone? Can we put it in an aerial drone? Can we swim it over a bay and find like the 6 biggest fish in the bay? You know, and I would have said that was Star Wars 10 or 20 years ago. It's not. It's coming. And the repercussions on the fish population, being able to catch it doesn't make it the right thing to do. Okay? It's got a whole different, man, I almost get emotional on that. It's got a whole different set of where we go and how we look after our fish and how we look after our populations. And in Canada, that means everything. So the new interest in the population, the new interest in musky fishing, it's the friggin' coolest fish you can chase. And that's why we're all here. And more people are going to find out about this. And the people who need to take care of it are right here. It's you, it's me, and it's guys like Sean who are going to do the science, who are going to lead the way to tell us, you know, what we're doing isn't good. What we're doing has these repercussions. And where we go with this, the rules we put in place to look after it, technology is going to drive that in the coming years. You know, before I leave this world and after I leave this world, I can't imagine where you people are going to be, you know. So if you got a few things to say on that, Sean.
Yeah, my thoughts on that is technology is such a double-edged sword, right? It's wonderful as anglers, man, like you can really catch, I think you can catch a lot more fish than you otherwise could have 20 years ago when we didn't have stuff like side scan sonar and high resolution, you know, 1-foot contour maps and auto chart mapping features and all, you know, stuff like that, right? Down imaging. But the reality is that it can potentially be problematic for fisheries. And this comes up repeatedly, especially in marine commercial fisheries. The managers that are trying to set, you know, appropriate quotas for the harvest of marine species are always confronted with advancements in technology that make the commercial fishermen that much more efficient at finding and harvesting fish. And it is always like management is always one step behind. And, you know, kudos to the guys and men and women that go out there and catch, you know, and catch and make a lot of money off of that. But at some point, you're going to reach a threshold where you catch a little bit more and you've got some major problems. So it really is a double-edged sword. We do have to be careful with it. And there, as you said, I'll just amplify what you said. You know, there's a right and a wrong way to use technology. And, you know, I'll give you an example. When I was doing my Project Noble Beast tracking, we would try and catch fish that we had positioned with the radio transmitters. And, you know, we were trying to catch them to see how they might behave a second time, you know, after being just recently caught. And we had some sort of, you know, other goals in mind. But we would always try for a little bit. And then after a while, it's like, okay, obviously that fish is sitting there and it hasn't moved. And we've thrown 30 casts at it and it's not going to move. So we're going to leave. We're not going to harass it anymore. And so, you know, there's a point where the technology is great. And then there's a point where you cross a line and you start, you know, harassing a fish. And so we just have to be a little bit careful. We got to figure out where that fine line is. And fortunately, most musky anglers do a really good job of handling the fish we catch. So if we are really efficient at catching these fish, chances are most of them will survive. Will there be a little mortality? Yeah, there will be a little bit more of mortality. You have to expect that. But for the most part, we do a pretty good job at handling the fish we catch and letting them go. But again, that goes back to an earlier comment, is that's incumbent on us to teach the next generation how to handle them properly, for sure.
Wow. Really well said. You and I have broken the all-time record for the Musky Monday seminar series over the limit time segment by a long shot today, Sean. I knew we would. It's not a surprise. Thank you so much for stepping up as you did yesterday. 2 hours and 5 minutes by me, just like that. And what a great segment maybe to end on today. That you know, as musky anglers, we have a responsibility that goes way beyond catching this fish. It's an apex predator. If you live in Canada, you have the best of the best of the best musky fishing and musky populations on this planet. The responsibility for looking after them fall on you and on me and on Sean. And so if you're going to chase this fish, you owe it to this fish to look after it and do everything you can to make sure that every single fish you catch goes back the way you found it or as close to that as possible. You have a responsibility to make sure that the population continues. And so it's way more than just catching the fish. It's caring about the fish, and it's looking after the future. And so that's part. If you take from something in life, you need to give back. And you know, as musky anglers, we do take from the population. There is a mortality rate associated with what we do. With the more pressure that we bring, all of us owe it to this fish and this fishery to give back and to maintain it for the next generation, because it is the most special fish that we hunt. Thanks so much for being here, Sean. Thanks to all the viewers and all the listeners to be here. Send in your questions. Send them to Sean. Send them directly to us. We will get to them. We'll see you all next week when Larry Ramsell comes on. What a show that's going to be. Sean, wow, wow, wow.
Happy to be here. It was a ton of fun.
It was. All the best, everyone. See you next week.
Bye, everyone.